In the Soviet Union, biographies were supposed to run in straight lines. A worker becomes a Bolshevik becomes a commander becomes a hero. The party's story demanded inevitability, history moving forward under the correct ideology, with the correct people. But real history is messier, and the Soviet state, despite all its slogans, often survived by doing what it claimed it would never do. It hired its enemies. It promoted men whose pasts were politically poisoned. It made room, quietly and pragmatically, for competence. No career exposes that contradiction more sharply than the rise of Leonid Alexandrovich Govorov, a man who began the Russian Civil War on the wrong side, fighting against the Red Army, and ended the Second World War as a Marshal of the Soviet Union, one of the highest military ranks the state could bestow. His transformation was not a sudden conversion story. It was a decade-by-decade test of whether a regime built on suspicion could accept results, whether loyalty could be proven not by slogans but by performance under fire, and whether the Soviet war machine, especially in its darkest moments, could afford to care more about ideology than about artillery trajectories. Govorov was born in the late Russian Empire, in a world where the officer corps was still shaped by imperial institutions, and where artillery, more than any other branch, demanded mathematical discipline. Artillery was not romantic. It was tables, angles, logistics, and the ability to coordinate men and metal under stress. That training would become his passport through political storms that killed far more famous men. But it also placed him, in 1918, on the side that would soon be labeled enemy of the people. When the Russian Empire collapsed into revolution and civil war, the country did not split neatly into reds and rights as propaganda posters later suggested. It fractured into regional armies, shifting coalitions and desperate improvisations. The Bolsheviks inherited the language of power, but not the institutions to wield it. They had political cadres, but they lacked experienced officers. The Whites had many of those officers, but they lacked unity and a coherent political program that could outcompete the Bolsheviks' ruthless clarity. In that chaos, Leonid Govorov found himself in the White camp, serving in the Western Separate Army and commanding an artillery battery. He earned promotion under Admiral Alexander Kolchak, the self-declared supreme ruler of Russia. His government in Omsk attempted to restore order through military authority and anti-Bolshevik resolve. Kolchak's forces, like much of the White movement, were a coalition held together by shared hatred of the Bolsheviks rather than by shared plans for Russia's future. Their rear areas were plagued by corruption and coercion. Their supply lines were fragile. Their political legitimacy was contested by peasants who feared a return of landlords and old hierarchies. By late 1919, the White cause in Siberia and the Urals was collapsing under Red Army pressure and internal disintegration. The Red Army, built in part by Leon Trotsky's organizational will and sustained by brutal discipline, was learning how to win. It was also learning how to absorb. When Kolchak's movement broke apart, thousands of officers faced a choice: flee, hide, or switch sides. Govorov defected to the Red Army in late 1919, entering a world that distrusted him on principle. The Bolsheviks had a term for men like him: military specialists, former Tsarist and White officers whose expertise was too valuable to discard. The policy was born of necessity. The Red Army could not be built from ideology alone. It needed professionals who understood modern war. But these specialists were watched closely by political commissars and security organs. Their families could be held hostage to ensure compliance. Their promotions could be blocked by suspicion. Their deaths could be arranged if their loyalty was doubted. The remarkable thing about Govorov is not simply that he survived this system. It is that he climbed it. He proved his loyalty the only way a former enemy could, by fighting repeatedly in battles where failure would have been easy to interpret as betrayal. In the southern campaigns of the Civil War, he fought against the forces of Baron Pyotr Wrangel in southern Ukraine and Crimea. Wrangel's army represented the last serious White military effort in European Russia, a disciplined remnant that tried to reorganize and reform too late, while the Red Army tightened the noose. Govorov fought with distinction. He was wounded twice. He received the Order of the Red Banner, one of the Soviet state's earliest and most meaningful decorations for battlefield courage and success. Awards in the early Soviet period were not merely ribbons, they were political signals. They marked a man as useful, as trusted at least for the moment. That trust mattered, because the 1920s and 1930s were not an era of stable gratitude. They were an era of institutional paranoia. The Soviet Union was built on the premise that enemies were everywhere: foreign spies, internal saboteurs, class enemies, traitors. And in the military, the state's fear was amplified by history itself. The Bolsheviks remembered that professional officers had once been their opponents. They remembered that armies could decide politics. They remembered that Napoleon had marched on revolutions and that coups were a permanent possibility. When Joseph Stalin consolidated power, that fear became policy. The Great Purge of the 1930, wrecked purge of the 1930, arrested in 1937 and executed after Sheksky, arrested in 1937 and executed after Sheky, arrested in 1937 and executed after. But the purge was not limited to one Marshal. It spread downward, consuming commanders, staff officers, engineers, and specialists. The result was not only human tragedy but strategic damage. The Red Army entered the Second World War missing much of its experienced leadership, with gaps filled by rapid promotions and political reliability rather than competence. Govorov survived. That survival was not luck alone. It was a product of how he navigated the Soviet system. He avoided politics. He did not build a Pertik. He focused on military professionalism, becoming valuable for what he could do rather than for what he could say. In a regime where words could be fatal, he made his career about calculations and results. He was not the kind of charismatic figure who attracted attention from rivals or from the security apparatus. He was the kind of officer who made artillery work, who made defensive lines hold, who could be placed into a crisis and expected to stabilize it. His competence became impossible to ignore during the Winter War of 1939-1940, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland and discovered that numerical superiority did not automatically translate into victory. The Soviet leadership had expected a quick campaign. Instead, the Red Army slammed into the Mannerheim Line, Finland's fortified defenses on the Karelian Isthmus, and suffered heavy losses. The war exposed the consequences of the purges: poor coordination, inadequate reconnaissance, rigid tactics, and an underestimation of a smaller but highly motivated defender fighting in difficult terrain and weather. Breaking the Mannerheim Line required methodical firepower. It required artillery planning on a scale the Soviet army could execute only if it had skilled professionals. Govorov helped plan the artillery operations that eventually breached those defenses. The Winter War ended with Finland forced to cede territory, but it also sent a message to the world and to Adolf Hitler that the Soviet military might be weaker than its size suggested. That perception would feed into the calculus behind Operation Barbarossa in 1941. In that sense, the Winter War was not only a Soviet-Finnish conflict, it was a prelude to the greatest invasion in modern history. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the Red Army experienced catastrophe. Entire formations were encircled and destroyed. Millions of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the first months. The Soviet state faced an existential threat, and it responded with a brutal mixture of Konyo, slick Mars, Lysiade, mass mobilization, and terror. Orders threatened commanders with execution for retreat. Political officers monitored loyalty. Factories were evacuated east. The country became a machine for survival. In that environment, the value of a commander like Govorov rose dramatically. Ideodald, Negat speeches could not halt the Wehrmacht's operational tempo, but well-cited artillery, disciplined defensive planning, and an ability to coordinate units under pressure could. By 1941, Govorov commanded the Fifth Army during the Battle of Moscow. The defense of Moscow was not a single battle, but a campaign of attrition and maneuver, as German forces pushed toward the Soviet capital in Operation Typhoon, and Soviet forces scrambled to hold, delay, and counterattack. The significance of Moscow in 1941 stated, it was the political center of the Soviet Union, the hub of rail networks, and a symbol that carried enormous psychological weight. If Moscow fell, the Soviet state might have fractured. Even if the government continued from the east, the blow to legitimacy could have been fatal. The Germans understood this. The Soviets understood it too. The defense became a test of whether the Soviet system could absorb shock and still function. Govorov's expertise in defensive artillery played a major role in halting German armored forces and enabling the Soviet counteroffensive. Artillery in defense is not merely firing at visible targets. It is shaping the battlefield, creating kill zones, breaking up assaults, forcing armor to slow, and supporting infantry so that lines do not collapse under pressure. In late 1941, as winter set in and German logistics strained, Soviet defenses stiffened. The Red Army, reinforced by fresh formations and benefiting from the weather and from Germany's overextension, launched a counteroffensive in December. Moscow did not fall. The myth of German invincibility cracked. But the war did not become easier. In 1942, the strategic center shifted. Germany pushed toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Leningrad, already under siege, continued to starve. The Soviet Union faced multiple crises at once, and its commanders were moved like pieces on a board, assigned to the fronts where the situation was most desperate. Govorov was sent to besiege Leningrad. Leningrad was not just a city. It was the former imperial capital, the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, and a major industrial center. When German and Finnish forces cut it off in 1941, the siege became one of the most lethal blockades in history. The city's population endured starvation, cold, and constant bombardment. Hundreds of thousands died. Factories continued to operate under shell fire. The Soviet state treated the city's survival as a matter of honor and propaganda, but for the people inside it was a daily struggle measured in grams of bread. Commanding the Leningrad front was not simply a military assignment. It was a political and moral burden. Failure meant not only military assignment, it was a political and moral burden. Failure meant not only military defeat, but the possible annihilation of a symbol. Success required coordination across land, air, and the fragile supply lifeline over Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, which in winter became a route across ice and in summer a route by boat, constantly threatened by German air attacks. The front had to defend the city, maintain internal order, and plan offensives to break the blockade all while the population weakened. Govorov reorganized the city's defenses. That phrase sounds bureaucratic, but in Leningrad it meant transforming chaos into structure. But in Leningrad it meant It meant improving artillery deployment, coordinating counter-battery fire against German guns that shelled the city, strengthening defensive belts, and ensuring that limited resources were used where they mattered most. It meant imposing professional discipline in an environment where emotion and desperation could easily override planning. In January 1943, Govorov orchestrated Operation Iskra, a Soviet offensive designed to break the blockade and restore a land corridor to the city. Iskra's spark was not the full liberation of Leningrad, but it was a turning point. The goal was to punch through German positions south of Lake Ladoga and connect Leningrad with Soviet forces outside the siege ring. The operation required coordination between fronts, careful timing, and concentrated firepower. In siege warfare, artillery is decisive. It suppresses defenses, destroys strong points, and enables infantry to advance through zones that would otherwise be death traps. Operation Iskra succeeded in opening a corridor, finally restoring a land connection. The consequences were immediate and strategic. Supplies could more like the city's ability to survive improved. The siege was not yet fully lifted, but the German stranglehold weakened. For the Soviet Union, it was proof that the Wehrmacht could be forced back even from heavily fortified positions. For Govorov, it was a demonstration that he could manage one of the war's most politically charged fronts and deliver results. By 1944, The strategic situation had shifted dramatically. The Red Army had survived the disasters of 1941, endured the brutal campaigns of 1942, and seized the initiative after the turning points of 1943. Soviet industry, relocated and mobilized, was producing vast quantities of weapons. The Red Army had learned, at immense cost, how to coordinate armor, infantry, artillery, and air power in deep operations. Germany was increasingly on the defensive, stretched across multiple fronts. In this context, Govorov led the Soviet offensive in Menin. Finland had fought the Soviet Union in the Winter War, and then, after 1941, entered the so-called Continuation War alongside Germany, seeking to regain lost territories and secure a better strategic position. By 1944, Finland's situation was precarious. The country faced the reality that Germany was losing and that continued fighting risked occupation or worse. The Soviet objective was to force Finland out of the war and secure Leningrad's approaches permanently. Finland's defenses on the isthmus included fortified lines, among them the VT line. Govorov's offensive broke through these fortifications with unprecedented speed and captured Vyborg in just 10 days, an achievement that stood in stark contrast to the months of struggle earlier in the war. Vyborg was not merely a city. It was a key strategic point, and its rapid capture signaled that Soviet operational capability had matured. It also sent a political message to Helsinki. The Red Army could reach deep into Finnish defenses quickly, and the price of continued resistance would be catastrophic. The consequences were strategic and diplomatic. The pressure on Finland intensified, contributing to the conditions that led Finland to seek an armistice later in 1944. For the Soviet Union, it meant a more secure northern flank and the ability to redirect resources. For Govorov personally, it was the kind of success that the Soviet system rewarded with rank and prestige. He was promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union, joining the small circle of commanders whose names would be carved into the official narrative of victory. That promotion is the hinge of his story. A man who had once served under Kolchak, who had fought against the Reds, was now elevated to the highest tier of Soviet military leadership. In a state that claimed ideological purity, this was a confession of reality. The Soviet Union, when pushed to extremes, elevated competence. It did not forget Govorov's origins. Nothing was ever fully forgotten in Stalin's system, but it decided that his usefulness outweighed the risk. In the final phase of the war, Govorov's operations shifted toward the Baltic region. The Baltics were strategically vital. They controlled access to the Baltic Sea, contained key ports, and served as a corridor between Germany and its northern forces. As Soviet offensives advanced, German Army Group North was pushed back and eventually became isolated in what became known as the Courland Pocket in Latvia, where German forces reorganized as Army Group Courland held out, even as Berlin itself faced encirclement. Containing and isolating Army Group Courland was not glamorous compared to the race to Berlin, but it was strategically important. Large German forces pinned in Courland could not be redeployed to defend the Reich. The Soviets had to ensure that these troops remained contained, preventing breakout attempts and maintaining pressure. This was the kind of operational problem suited to a commander who understood firepower, defensive planning, and the grinding logic of attrition. On May 9, 1945, after Germany's surrender, Govorov accepted the surrender of the commander of Army Group Courland, formally concluding the liberation of Soviet territory. The date itself is significant. May 9th is celebrated in Russia as Victory Day, marking the end of the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet narrative. Govorov's role in accepting surrender tied him symbolically to the war's conclusion, linking his personal arc to the state's most sacred modern myth. To understand why Govorov's career remains so striking, it helps to see what had to happen for it to be possible. First, the Bolsheviks had to make a decision early in the Civil War that contradicted their own ideological instincts, to employ former enemy officers as military specialists. Without that pragmatic choice, the Red Army might have remained a militia-like force incapable of defeating better-led opponents. Second, Govorov had to demonstrate loyalty not through declarations but through repeated service in critical campaigns, earning wounds and decorations that served as proof. Third, He had to survive the purges, which destroyed many officers regardless of competence, and which made any past association with the whites potentially fatal. His avoidance of political games and his focus on professionalism made him less visible as a threat and more valuable as a tool. Fourth, the Soviet Union had to face existential wars against Finland, against Nazi Germany, where competence could no longer be treated as optional. Each stage had consequences. The absorption of specialists helped build a functioning army, but it also entrenched a culture of surveillance and mistrust that never fully disappeared. The purges weakened the Red Army and contributed to the disasters of 1941, which in turn forced the Soviet system to elevate effective commanders rapidly. The Winter War's difficulties helped shape foreign perceptions of Soviet weakness, influencing German calculations, which then unleashed a war that demanded the very kind of professional expertise the purges had endangered. Govorov's successes at Moscow and Leningrad contributed to Soviet survival and to the eventual shift toward strategic initiative. His breakthrough on the Karelian Isthmus helped push Finland out of the war, securing the north and enabling Soviet focus elsewhere. His containment of Courland ensured German forces remained trapped until the end. And yet, Govorov's story is not simply a celebration of merit. It is also a story about the Soviet state's capacity to redefine loyalty. In the USSR, loyalty was never a private matter of belief. It was a public performance measured by service, obedience, and outcomes. Govorov's early service with the Whites did not vanish, but it was overwritten by a record that the state could not deny: wounds received fighting its enemies, an Order of the Red Banner, successful planning against Finland, defensive skill at Moscow, leadership in Leningrad, the breaking of the blockade through Operation Iskra, the rapid capture of Vyborg, and the final containment of German forces in Courland. This is why his career still resonates in modern discussions of Soviet history. It exposes the tension between ideology and necessity. The Soviet Union presented itself as a state of class certainty, but its survival depended repeatedly on compromise with reality, including the recruitment and promotion of people whose pasts contradicted the official story. Govorov's rise also illustrates the centrality of artillery and operational planning in Soviet victory. The Red Army's triumph was not only a matter of manpower and sacrifice, it was also a matter of learning how to coordinate firepower on an industrial scale, of turning war into a system. Govorov, trained in the old imperial tradition and refined through Soviet experience, became one of the men who made that system lethal. In the end, the takeaway is uncomfortable and revealing. The Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany and emerged as a superpower, but it did so by relying on individuals whose lives did not fit the ideological template. Govorov's path from fighting the Reds in 1918-1919 to accepting German surrender in 1945 is not a neat morality play. It is a case study in how states at war redefine identity, how competence can become a form of political protection, and how a regime built on suspicion sometimes has no choice but to entrust its survival to the very kinds of men it once condemned. The modern consequence is that the myths nations tell about themselves, about purity, loyalty, and destiny, often conceal the pragmatic bargains that actually determine who wins and who survives.